Great, thank you, Kate, and hello everyone. So thank you very much for joining this webinar on agroforestry and the reforest project, which is hosted by Pasture for Life, obviously, but also the Agri-Food Network Plus. So I'm Charlotte, as Kate said, I'm the research officer at Pasture for Life, and I'm also the circular food systems champion at the Agri-Food Network Plus, and I'll be chairing today. So if this is your first webinar interaction with either of those organizations, Kate gave you a good introduction to Pasture for Life. And I'll just say about the Agri-Food Network, it is a £5 million UKRI funded project, which is focused on identifying research gaps that can help reduce emissions in the UK agri-food sector. So if you aren't a member of either of those organizations, please do think about joining, because we're doing a lot of fantastic work across the board and there's great webinars on both sides. And so I'll just put the link in the chat here for both of those in case you want to learn more. So on to today's topic. So we're joined by Dr. Tom Staton of Reading University and Dr. Will Simonson from the Organic Research Centre, who have very kindly agreed to join us and kick off the winter webinar series to discuss their recent work on agroforestry, specifically the REFOREST project. So Tom is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Reading. He is an ecologist by background and has been studying agroforestry systems in the UK and Europe since 2017. He's also particularly interested in how agroforestry can contribute to environmental, social, and economic sustainability. Will is the principal researcher in agroforestry at the Organic Research Centre since 2020, and he has been involved in Horizon Project's AgroMix and REFOREST, and a portfolio of other agroforestry research and knowledge exchange projects. He's a doctorate in forest ecology and conservation, and prior to ORC, he worked in a Cambridge-based international environmental NGO on projects relating to agroforestry, biodiversity, and climate change adaptation. Oh, I've just lost my light bulb, so it's a little bit darker in here now. Okay, so I'm not going to introduce the project itself, but I'll leave that to our much more capable speakers. But I just wanted to remind viewers to please feel free to use the chat function at the bottom for a general discussion, as well as sharing links of anything relevant. But in terms of questions, please just feel free to use the Q&A box as well, which should be down at the middle of your screen with a question mark in it. And I'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the presentations, and we'll do a Q&A section right at the end for about 20 minutes. So please just pop questions into the Q&A as and when you have them, and I'll keep an eye on that. And just to remind anyone who's joined later that we are recording this, and it'll be available on our YouTube channel. So I'll just hand over to Will and Tom now and try and get my light bulb working in the background. But yeah, thank you so much for joining, and take it away.
Great, thank you very much, Charlotte, and thank you, Charlotte and Kate, for the invitation for Tom and I to be part of this webinar series and for hosting this particular one this evening. So yes, my name is Will Simonson, and I'm kicking off this this presentation that we're going to be doing about agroforestry research and the REFOREST project. So just to describe what we're going to cover in the next little less than an hour, is first of all give a bit of an introduction to agroforestry in the UK and to introduce the REFOREST project. So I'll be doing that in the next minutes. And then I'll hand over to Tom to talk about one of the activities under REFOREST, which are these sustainability assessments using the public goods tool. So he'll describe that work. And then I'll come back to focus a little bit more about the Living Lab approach, which is fundamental to REFOREST, and to talk about some of the other decision support tools that are part of it, in particular the so-called farm tree tool. And then there'll be some time at the end of that Q&A. And we've also prepared a little survey, actually, because it would be really helpful to get some feedback on perspectives on different information products about agroforestry and different approaches to learning about agroforestry. So we'll come to that towards the end. So what is agroforestry? Well, simply put, it's farming with trees. But then there's this more elaborated definition, which talks about the practice of deliberately integrating woody vegetation, trees or shrubs, with crop and or animal systems to benefit from the ecological and economic interactions. It's sometimes been characterized by the 4 I's, so the intentional integration of trees and shrubs into agricultural systems, managed intensively for beneficial interactions. And managed intensively there is really talking not about intensity of inputs, but rather the intensity of kind of decisions that need to be made as you manage, as you design and then manage an agroforestry system. But of course, there are different subtypes. So you may well have heard about silvo-arable and silvopasture, silvo-horticulture, etc. The term alley cropping is often used to distinguish where you have lines of trees across a field, in contrast to, for example, wood pasture. And then there's also the so-called boundary agroforestry. So your hedgerows and your shelter belts, maybe woodland along riparian strips along the rivers. And so with all of these different types of agroforestry, you start to see that actually the UK is, in essence, an agroforestry landscape, or if you like, has the potential to be, to the extent in which those trees and shrubs are being deliberately integrated into the system. So it's not a modern concept, it's maybe a modern word for what is returning to a traditional type of land management approach. Why the current interest in agroforestry? Well, I think it's part of a wider agenda to restore tree cover in a country which is one of the most deforested in the world. So for England, we have the 25-year Environment Plan, which DEFRA published in 2018, which includes the target to increase woodland cover in England to about 12% by 2060, which involves planting 180,000 hectares by the end of 2042. In the 5-year update of that plan, which DEFRA was obliged to publish in 2023, this is called the Environment Improvement Plan. That provides some more definition to the actions that are needed to realise the goals of the Environment Plan, including promoting the planting of trees on farmland through subsidy options as part of the environmental land management schemes. And as some of you will know, that these new options, grants for agroforestry, are being rolled out as part of the Sustainable Farming Incentive this year. So informing these policy goals are the advice of the government's Climate Change Committee, which in 2020 produced their Land Use Policies for Net Zero UK report, which includes a recommendation to increase forest cover to at least 17% of the UK's land area by 2050 by planting between 90 and 120 million trees per year by 2025. And then in their sixth carbon budget policy document of that same year, they have some further recommendations, including to plant trees on 10% of farmland while maintaining their primary use and extending hedgerows by 20% by 2035. So clearly the potential of trees to contribute to the achievement of net zero in the land use sector, that's quite plain. But trees have obviously got a lot of other benefits, and well recognized too are the biodiversity benefits of trees. Now this infographic on the left is from a review paper by Florian Cletti, published last year in Agriculture, Ecosystems and Environment. And he and his co-workers, they reviewed 45 papers, studies on silver arable systems, so the integration of trees into cropping systems, and looking at what the evidence is for the biodiversity impact of that practice is. And this infographic is summarizing that. So each of the little numbers there represents one peer-reviewed journal article. And this is really emphasizing the many positive benefits for agriculturally important biodiversity, so the natural predators of common pest species and pollinators, soil organisms as well, but also for biodiversity that's of importance for conservation, and that's the top spur there. And you can see from this infographic, there's lots of evidence for the positive benefits, but some evidence for negative benefits as well. And I think the important point here is that putting trees into your fields is not a universal automatic solution to the biodiversity crisis, if you like. It can have many cases have positive impacts, but that really does depend a lot on the design of the agroforestry and on its management. And that's what that little picture infographic on the right is trying to demonstrate, that it depends on the landscape context, it depends on the width of the alleys and how they are managed, it depends on which tree species are planted and how those are managed as well. But of course, for agroforestry to be important in British farming, it has to show benefits in terms of production as well. And so I think one of the arguments here for agroforestry is the fact that it's, in a sense, more three-dimensional form of farming. It's able to enhance the capture of solar radiation so that the tree crowns, the tree foliage is photosynthesizing, for example, through parts of the year in which many of the crops have ceased to do so. And this in part explains why you can often find greater production overall per land unit, per land area with an agroforestry system compared to the equivalent monoculture cropping or grazing. And this has been estimated, calculated for a number of different systems. And you typically get a value, so-called land equivalent ratio value of 1.4, which represents how you're getting more for your land area. But there's also arguments around the resilience of that production, particularly when we're seeing more weather extremes in Britain. So, you know, in the face of more flooding, for example, the improved water infiltration that's aided by trees, the soil conservation that they help with is really important. So also is buffering the impacts of drought spells, of extreme heat waves, where the tree canopies can have an important effect on the microclimate and reducing the evapotranspiration of crops and things like that. And of course, for the grazing animals, trees are incredibly important, aren't they, in providing that shade, providing the browse that's nutritionally and medicinally important, and simply providing those more naturalistic settings in which the animals' well-being is improved by being able to exert more natural behaviours. And a final argument on the resilience front is also the diversification of enterprises that the trees within your farming system are able to afford. So the additional crops that you're getting, products you're getting from your trees. How have we got to this level of knowledge so far in 2024? Well, I think there's a lot to be said for the kind of pioneering kind of experimental and demonstration farms that was established back in the last, well, in the sort of late 1960s, 70s onwards. So, for example, in the right-hand photograph here, that's Lochel in Northern Ireland, run by the Agri-Food and Biodiversity Institute of Deira. And this was, I think, set up in the late 60s or early 70s as part of the Silver Pasture National Network experiment that ran through till about 2001. I think there were 8 such sites around the country, and there was a similar network of silver arable, 3 silver arable sites as well. On the left, many will recognise Wakelands in Suffolk, which again is another pioneering agroforestry farm that was established by the late Professor Martin Wolf, and is very much alive and kicking now. One of those few agroforestry farms where you can really see what it looks like in its maturity. So it has tremendous demonstration value. So as well as those experimental demonstration farms, there have been some really very important collaborations at the European level. AgForward is one of them. So this ran between 2014 and 2017. Funded by Horizon as part of the European Commission's 7th Framework Programme. And that did a number of different sort of research modelling activities, as well as some really important knowledge exchange work and opportunities for peer-to-peer learning. So too was AFANET. So AgForward was led by Paul Burgess at Cranfield. So AFANET followed on, led by a Spanish institution, but doing much the same work in terms of networking agroforestry practitioners and researchers and other stakeholders, producing all sorts of interesting and useful outputs, fact sheets and research digests, etc. So these have been tremendously important. There's the Agroforestry Handbook, of course. So for many, this has been the kind of go-to guide for those who are wanting to explore agroforestry and start to adopt it. That was published in 2019, edited by Ben Raskin and Simone Osborne at the Soil Association. And so over the decades, we've been basically building up what we could call the sort of agroforestry knowledge infrastructure, and that's been really incredibly important, particularly for this moment in time where we're starting to see more specific government support and grant options for agroforestry. So ORC has been part of a number of tests and trials, this co-design process for the ELM schemes, and we, working with the Soil Association, Woodland Trust and the National Trust, we've been looking at what are some of the knowledge needs of farmers, how they actually prefer to get that knowledge and learning, what some of the barriers and challenges that they face, and how they see that working out as part of the ELMs. So as part of that work, we've been sort of thinking about all of these different information products and approaches and what works best and so on. And I think, sure, we've got these demonstration farms that we've noted that I've already mentioned. We've got the kind of peer-to-peer learning opportunities. There's the Agroforestry Open Weekend, for example, that's been running for the last few years. We have the online knowledge hubs that projects such as AgForward and AFANET have developed. We've got the Agroforestry Handbook and other written resources. We've got the formal education in the form of the master's course in agroforestry and food security at Bangor, and the training that the likes of FarmEd and the Agroforestry Research Trust do. And there's online training as well by the Soil Association and others. We have different networks and initiatives like the Farm Woodland Forum, the Integrated Trees Network in Scotland. There's conferences and meetings. We had the amazing Agroforestry show last year, which was an excellent success, and got the annual meeting of the Farm Woodland Forum as another example. Advisory services are really important. Digital tools are being developed. And I guess the question is, how well are all of these different approaches filling those information needs, and what more needs to be done? And into that space has arrived the project REFOREST, which Tom and I are involved in. So this is actually halfway through, in fact. It started in the summer of 2022. And it's about agroforestry at the forefront of farming sustainability in multifunctional landscapes in Europe. It says on the left banner there, and some of the main statistics are also there. So it has 14 partners working in 10 different countries around Europe, and it's got established 8 different living labs across that network of partners and countries as well. And these are the stated kind of objectives on the right-hand side. So it's around building on these earlier projects to develop further our understanding. There's still a lot to learn about agroforestry design and its practice and management. It's about local innovation through fostering that through the living labs. It's about the performance measurement and prediction activities, that third bullet point there. Some of the tools that we're developing are helping with that. And also how you actually monitor that performance over time. So looking at some innovative ways for that. Also the financial modeling, I think there's still a lot to learn about the economics of agroforestry. That's really important. And then of course the policy impact. So that is introducing REFOREST in a nutshell. And I'm now going to hand over to Tom, who's going to describe one of the activities he's been leading on within the project.
Yeah, thanks, Will. So let me just share the slides. Okay, yeah, so in this part, I'm just going to take about 10 or 15 minutes to talk through some of the work we've been doing looking at sustainability assessments of agroforestry farms, focusing on farms in the UK. So in this task, we were interested in looking at what are the kind of stronger versus less consistent areas of sustainability in agroforestry systems. I'll talk a bit more about what I mean by the kind of different areas of sustainability. Are there any key characteristics of agroforestry farms that impact sustainability? And then finally, does the sustainability of agroforestry farms differ according to kind of different types of agroforestry systems that we've heard a bit about? Different tree densities, different tree species diversity. So to explore this, we've been using the Public Goods Tool, or PG tool for short. And this was originally developed over 10 years ago, actually, by the Organic Research Centre. And it was originally developed to look at the public goods or sustainability of farms that were transitioning to organic. But since then, it's been adapted for lots of different purposes. And that's included more recently adaptations by the Sustain Farm project to look at non-food, or to include non-food biomass in the tool. And then more recently, over the past year or two, we've been adapting it under this REFOREST project to include agroforestry systems in the tool. So the tool really works for any farm. It works at the farm level. Any farm that has agroforestry, it doesn't need to be organic. Any farm that has has agroforestry on it. And so the public goods tool is based on an Excel spreadsheet. And what we do is visit the farm for about half a day and then go through the spreadsheet with the farmer in person. And we look at these 9 different areas of sustainability. So we try and take a kind of holistic view of sustainability by looking at it as widely as possible. And this is an example sheet from the Excel. So here we're looking at soil management. And so we ask questions, for example, whether the farmer undertakes soil analysis, whether they are increasing, decreasing, or maintaining soil organic matter levels, and then some questions about soil management, winter grazing, erosion. And then based on the responses that the farmer gives, we then assign a score to that answer, which is the scale of 1 to 5. And then that score is kind of averaged across all the different answers for that category. And so, for example, on this farm, I think this is just a hypothetical farm, this farm's got a score of 3.7 out of 5 for soil management based on those responses. So it's all based on farmer responses. There's no kind of field data collection, which is perhaps a limitation because we're just assuming that the kind of farmer self-reported information is correct. But it means that it's quite a rapid process. So far, we've applied this tool to 12 agroforestry farms in the UK, in fact, all in England and Wales at the moment. We're aiming to add another 5 or 10. So if there are any farmers on the call who are interested, we'd be delighted to involve you. We're a bit limited in how far we can travel from Reading, but do drop me a note if you're interested. You just need to have some agroforestry on your farm. We've looked at a whole different range of farms in terms of the size of farms and different types of agroforestry systems. So we've looked at some very well-established systems like Wakelands to much more recently planted agroforestry systems. And we've included a few different farm types as well. So most include some livestock, whether that's kind of pure livestock or mixed in with arable, and a couple of horticulture farms as well. So this is a kind of quick overview of the results that we found so far. So this is showing the results for all 12 farms. And what we're looking here is at a score of 0 to 5 for each of the categories of sustainability. And the blue line here is the mean average score across all the farms, with the black line being their minimum score and the red line being the highest score that we've had so far. And I've just tried to kind of simplify this a little bit, just picked out 4 categories here which have scored consistently highly. So these 4 categories circled, all of the farms have scored at least 3 out of 5 for those categories. And I'm just going to talk a bit about each of them in turn and talk through some notable findings so far. So one of the categories that scored consistently highly was soil management. So 9 out of the 12 farms reported that they had no soil erosion problems at all. And the other 3 farms, they had less than 10% soil erosion. Of course, that's just a farmer self-reported figure, but it does support the existing literature that we have that suggests that agroforestry systems are very good at preventing or reducing soil erosion. And all of the farms also included other measures to reduce soil erosion other than agroforestry. So a lot of them, for example, included cover cropping. And most of the farms monitored their soil organic matter levels. And that's just shown in this pie chart at the bottom here. So here we can see that this is asking the farmer how often they undertake soil analysis. And all but one of the farms did some soil analysis. Only one said never. And quite a few said they undertake soil analysis every year. So clearly, agroforestry farms are very interested in protecting their soil, which is perhaps no great surprise, but it's good to have that confirmed. So the next area I'll talk about, which scored consistently highly, was social capital. This was something that really struck me, actually, because often we talk about the environmental benefits of agroforestry in terms of carbon and biodiversity and soil protection. I think often we don't hear so much about the social capital, but there are, I think, potential for really strong benefits here. So, for example, we found that the agroforestry farms had consistently high levels of public access and community involvement. So 11 out of the 12 farms scored 4 out of 5 on that. And interestingly, a lot of the farms kind of used that to overcome some of the challenges around agroforestry to do with kind of processing their tree products and getting some added value from the tree products. Because one of the challenges of agroforestry is that trees are being grown at quite a low density, so there's quite a low quantity of the tree crop coming off the farm. So trying to find value in that is a key challenge. And often involving the community or involving local businesses, for example, through enterprise stacking, can help to kind of realize the value of those kind of small quantity products and more niche products. Also, most of the farms scored well for high human health and well-being. And then at the bottom here, I've just included this question about to what extent do the tree products affect the working environment? Actually, most of the farms said they didn't really have any noticeable effect on the working environment, often because the trees were quite young at that stage. And then we also had a mix of kind of positive and negative responses here. So it's quite interesting that trees can be seen as a positive in terms of opportunities for employment and well-being. But there can also be negatives. It is more work, of course, potentially more jobs to do on the farm, so it can cause increased workload. So business resilience also scored consistently highly. I've just picked out a couple of interesting questions here. So on the left, we have this question, how have your net assets changed in the past year? And none of the farmers said that their net assets had decreased. So we had about a third saying not much change, and then the other 2/3 were increased by more or less than 5%. So that was quite positive. And then on the right, we asked the farmers how their farm is doing financially. Obviously, this is quite subjective, but it's quite interesting to gauge the kind of farmers' feeling for how they think they're doing. And about half of them said they were making a reasonable living, which I think is quite positive. Quite a few said they were just surviving. None of them said they were struggling, which was another option. So that was quite a positive kind of aspect, despite the costs of planting and maintaining trees. And the final category, which scored consistently highly, was for animal welfare. So we've heard a bit about that already from Will. And again, this is quite a well-documented benefit of agroforestry, so not too surprising. But the farms all scored consistently highly for animal health and natural behaviours. And all of the farms reported that they had average or below average mortality or culling rates. They had above average longevity of their livestock. All of the farms included some management methods to reduce parasite burdens. And in all cases, the livestock had some access to tree and shrub fodder. So yeah, we found quite good consistent benefits for livestock welfare. Just to quickly mention the 3 less consistent areas of sustainability, which were much more variable. So one of them was agricultural system diversity, perhaps a bit surprisingly, because agroforestry is diverse in itself. But some of the farms were otherwise quite simple in terms of the number of different crops and livestock they had. So clearly agroforestry can be applied to those more kind of simple farms as well. Landscape and heritage was very variable. So there was varying management of things like boundary features and landscape features, and also historic features, and the use of heritage crops and rare breeds was quite variable. And then finally, governance was quite variable. So this included questions about use of things like sustainability tools and carbon calculators and sustainability management plans. So that's perhaps quite surprising that was quite variable, but I think a lot of the farms, although they were very interested in sustainability, often their approach was quite informal. So they didn't necessarily kind of document their sustainability practices through things like tools and carbon calculators and management plans. So just to mention, we've also been looking at some correlations between these different sustainability categories, which is quite interesting. None of this is statistically significant, so take it with a pinch of salt. But this diagram is showing that the blue categories here are where we're seeing positive correlations between the different categories, with the size of the dot being the strength of the correlation. And there seems to be some suggestion here that soil management is quite positively correlated with other kind of categories of sustainability. So in other words, that means that farms that have that score highly for soil management tend to score highly in other categories as well. So that's perhaps quite a good proxy for their sustainability. So a few key takeaways: agroforestry farms performed consistently highly for their soil management, for social capital, for business resilience and animal welfare. And there's some indication that soil management was positively correlated with the other aspects of sustainability. And in terms of next steps, we'd like to get a few more farms, get a bit more data, and then I think it would be interesting to compare sustainability of different types of agroforestry systems, perhaps also look at comparing early adopters with more recent adopters and see if there's any kind of patterns there. So just before I hand back to Will, just wanted to kind of mention a couple of other things we're working on. So one task we're just starting at the moment actually is looking at this, the current situation around agroforestry advice and knowledge sharing. So we'll introduce that at the end of his part, and how important that is. I think this is a really exciting task because the success of the policies around agroforestry will really depend on the effectiveness of the advice, because agroforestry done well can have lots of benefits, as we've seen, but agroforestry done badly is a disaster. So we need good advice to help farmers in designing and maintaining and monitoring these systems. So we're looking at the strengths, weaknesses and opportunities in terms of the current status of agroforestry knowledge in various European countries. So that includes both public and private advisory bodies, as well as peer-to-peer learning. I think that's really important in the agroforestry sector, is farmers learning from other farmers who have already done it. And we'll be taking this PESTLE approach, which looks at these different categories here. So it aims to be quite holistic in terms of looking at it from different angles. So hopefully we'll have some kind of more results on that in the next year or so. And then finally, related to agroforestry advice actually, but this is under a different project which has been funded by DEFRA. We've just finished developing a tree species guide for agroforestry. This is aimed at farmers and advisors and anyone involved in designing an agroforestry system. So it aims to be kind of very simple and easy to use. We're just in the final stages of production now. So this will be available hopefully in late November. And just to give you a sneak preview of what it looks like. So we have a kind of introductory section that goes through the different attributes of the trees we're looking at. Then we get to this tree species guide itself. So we've focused on 33 tree species. I would have loved to have done more, so this isn't exhaustive at all. We've just had to kind of prioritize based on our resources. And then for each species, we have 2 pages. So the first page goes into some physical characteristics like height, canopy cover, canopy density, and some silvicultural characteristics like establishment time, establishment and management requirements. And then the second page looks at a few more categories related to environmental tolerances like high and low temperatures, wind, drought, waterlogging, some environmental impacts like carbon sequestration, as well as resilience to pests and diseases and climate change. And then some productivity factors like the products coming from the tree, impacts on soil quality, shade cover, and livestock fodder benefits. So hopefully some of you will find that useful. We've tried to make it kind of simple and easy to use. So watch out for that. We'll be trying to publicize it as widely as possible. And that's it. Thanks for listening, and I'll hand back over to Will.
Great, thanks, Tom. So just resharing some slides for myself for this final segment of the presentation, which I'll just describe a little bit more about the living lab approach that we're adopting in REFOREST, and talk about one further tool that we're developing, and give a brief intro to another one as well. So first of all, living labs. So these don't refer to what one might expect as a field on a farm where some kind of experimental trial is taking place. It's actually geographically bounded, but it's much wider than that. So there's a definition here, which I find one of the most helpful, which is that living labs are initiatives in which experimentation is conducted on real farms in specific territorial and community contexts, with farmers and other actors involved from the beginning as equal partners in proposing ideas, testing them, and improving them, and promoting them further. So it's become quite a common approach across Europe for research and innovation projects, and increasingly in the UK, there's a lot of interest now. And it'd be actually useful if there's time in the discussion that we have at the end, if anybody's involved in another living lab, just to hear about one or two experiences of that. Within REFOREST, we've further characterized them in terms of what we've called the CRAMS criteria or characteristics. So each of those, that acronym stands for, first of all, co-creation. So co-creation, co-design, and co-development of solutions. So the idea here being involving different stakeholders from the beginning of the project in formulating the questions and inputting into the approach to solve them. So that's the C, co-creation. Secondly, testing and experimentation in real-life conditions. So showing that the project outcomes are relevant to the stakeholders' perspective. Thirdly, active involvement of the end users so that they can have a clear impact in the innovation process. Fourthly, use of multiple methods and tools originating from a range of different disciplines and domains. And finally, participation of stakeholders from lots of different sectors. And so not just thinking about the end users, but also other actors that are going to be involved in agroforestry value chains. So they're the CRAMS criteria. Within REFOREST, as I mentioned, we've established 8 living labs. They're shown on this map here. Just to give you a flavour, those 3 photographs, the one in the top right is from the Czech Republic, from northwest Bohemia, where there's a 600-hectare organic farm integrating fruit orchards with livestock. So that's one example. In the centre photograph is the experimental, the research farm of Inagro, an organisation in Flanders in Belgium, where they've recently established a walnut-based alley cropping system. And in the bottom left is a little shot of one of the 3 farms, agroforestry farms in Hungary, which are part of their network within their living lab. So there's a diversity of different agroforestry systems, silver pasture as well as silver arable. Some are adopting what we call a hub and spoke model, so where there's a sort of central facility, sometimes a research farm linked to the local farming community. But others are more of a kind of network of stakeholders, some of whom are practicing agroforestry, others might be interested or involved in associated value chains. But all of them are seeking to exchange information, ideas, and to inform and test the tools for decision support in agroforestry. ORC has been leading the work of establishing these living labs, and we've been using the CRAMS criteria as a framework and means to do a self-assessment amongst the partners about how the work of their living labs is going. So at the kickoff meeting for the living labs, we asked the partners to actually set out across these different criteria, the CRAMS criteria, where they thought they were at the beginning of the journey, where they wanted to get to at the end of last year. We did another assessment when we met as a project team in May of this year. And that's just a way of sort of keeping on track, making sure that the living labs are fulfilling the objectives for which we need of them for the REFOREST project. Within the UK Living Lab, our main engagement with stakeholders has been in the north of the country. We had a kick-off meeting at Cockle Park, which is the research farm of Newcastle University, where we spent some time sitting around and identifying some key challenges in agroforestry practice, particularly in the upland settings in the north of England. Those discussions were continued in October of last year when we met at one farm, Garbarrow Hall Farm in Cumbria. And we looked at some of the issues around integrating trees and grazing in uplands. We've been producing a bi-monthly newsletter to our mailing list within the Living Lab. We had an online webinar last winter involving Andrew Barber and Kat Sharp from Scotland, again exploring agroforestry and upland landscapes and their potential. We also held a workshop about livestock and trees at the Carbon Calling event this last summer. And we've got another one coming up, quite a practical hands-on one about sweet chestnut and hazelnut coppicing within agroforestry type systems as well. And we've also been doing some field data collection on a number of the farms to sort of support their kind of model calibration and validation within REFOREST. And just to introduce, so one of those models and tools is the Farm Tree tool. So Farm Tree is a Dutch social enterprise, and it created some years ago a model or tool to help design, compare, and report on a diverse range of agroforestry systems. It was actually developed and has been applied in tropical agroforestry, and as a partner of REFOREST, the Farm Tree team have been developing a model that fits temperate agroforestry systems as relevant to the UK. So the idea with Farm Tree is that with the input of relatively simple data about one's agroforestry system, shown in this picture on the left-hand side, into the model and tool, the model then draws upon its own database, draws upon open source data on science, on soils and climate, to eventually come out with a number of kind of key performance indicator projections for that system. So these might be around, things like cash flow, which are really important for farmers, but there's kind of other indicators that are relevant to other sectors that are interested in agroforestry as well. So the interface is relatively straightforward, very user-friendly, but of course behind that there's a kind of all the workings of the model itself, which has subcomponents to do with the soils, the water, the tree growth, the nutrient cycling, the financials, and everything else that really makes up the agroforestry system. And as part of REFOREST, the Farm Tree team have been, as I said, creating this temperate model, and that's involved introducing over 80 new temperate trees that are commonly used in agroforestry in Europe. It's involved introducing a seasonal aspect to the modelling, which wasn't so important in the tropical setting. And it's also been, for example, increasing the number of European languages to 8. So just in terms of accessibility, that's really important, so that it's a tool that can be picked up and used across different European countries. These just show some of the what the projections look like. So they're very visual, they're in this kind of plot form and very intuitive to understand kind of what's going on in terms of things like the vegetation cover, the yields that can be expected over the project duration, the carbon dioxide equivalent stocks, and cash flows, the nutrient stocks, water flows. So all of these little charts, the x-axis, I should have said, is the years of time across the project, and then you've got those different variables measured and projected in this very visual and understandable way. So as within REFOREST, we've been creating so-called Living Lab digital twins to some of the Living Lab farms. So these are models of those farms that help to project forward what can be expected in terms of the performance of those agroforestry systems, and to then test those using real-life data. So this is just showing the development of one such model. So this is for the Cockle Park research farm that I mentioned earlier, where we had our kickoff meeting for the Living Lab. And this is a willow and poplar silver arable system, and one can start off by just simply drawing a polygon around that agroforestry plot, and from that the model then retrieves that open source data on the climate and soils, or else you can input your more kind of more specific information that you might have, data that you might have for that farm. That's also possible. And then you state your tree species, their densities, and you can actually go into the behind the scenes, if you like, to start tinkering with things like the expected crown dimensions and the distances between the trees, the costs of the establishment, so the cost per seedling, the other initial costs and maintenance costs, things like that. You can rely on the default variables, if you like, default variables within the model, or else, yeah, as we're doing as part of the reforest, in terms of setting this up properly, we're actually going in and modifying all of that to try and develop some really realistic projection on the performance. And the right-hand side there just shows you can also specify what sorts of products you're going to have from those trees. So, you know, with willow, it's sort of specifying biomass and then considering what might be a price that you get per kilogram and so on. And so you do all of that, and then eventually you're able to explore some of what it's projecting that system will produce. So this first graph is just an initial summary of the kind of cover, vegetation cover, if you like, over time for that system. But as you can see from the tabs listed along the top there, you can then explore things like the biomass and the yields, the labor, the finances, the carbon, soil, hydrology, nutrients, and everything else. So it's quite sophisticated, it's quite powerful, but of course it's only as good as data that's put in, and in a sense as good as it's been well calibrated for European settings. So that's all the work that we're doing at the moment. Just to introduce one of the other tools, and this is really just in a sense a teaser for what I think should probably be another webinar altogether, because there's so much to say about this. But this is another quite innovative approach about monitoring and verification using remote sensing imagery and machine learning. So there are two different versions of that, and one is producing predictive models for landscape biodiversity, soil carbon, using satellite imagery as per the European Space Agency Sentinel multispectral, hyperspectral satellite images, training those images with empirical data sets on soil carbon or biodiversity, which will then create a model for which you can then make predictions around other agroforestry sites for configurations of trees and areas of woodland in the landscape, and come up with an estimation of what's going on in terms of that carbon and biodiversity story. And then there's a second version, a finer scale one, which again is a predictive model using the same sorts of neural network modeling techniques, which is actually in this case using drone imagery, and again calibrated by empirical data that you're collecting from the field to do that more detailed characterization of some of those environmental benefits of agroforestry. So with that, that's my final slide, and thank you for listening. And I think we can now go to the little survey that Tom's going to lead, and then some Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So now we have a kind of interactive session. So we're going to bring up a Menti poll, which some of you might have used before. So let me just bring this up and present it. So for this, you just need a device that's connected to the internet. So that can be the same device as you're using to join the Zoom call, or a different one if you prefer. So a phone, laptop, computer, tablet. And if you go to menti.com and then type in this 8-digit code, then it should let you in to the Menti. And then it should bring up this question about who you are, basically. So we'll be interested to know our audience. So would you say that you're mainly a farmer grower, or a researcher, an advisor, a policymaker, a policy influencer, or something completely different? So I'll give you a minute to hopefully navigate your way into Menti. Somebody's found it already, and put in your responses there. Great. So 6 responses so far, up to 8 now. So a bit of a mix of farmers, growers, and researchers so far. So up to 13, so about half the participants on the call now, I think, responded. So just give you a few more moments to log into Menti and answer that first question. So yeah, fairly even split at the moment between farmers, growers, and researchers. Couple of advisors and 3 something else. Yeah, no policymakers on the call. Not that they're admitting to anyway. It's great, we're up to 7 researchers. 17 responses, that's pretty good. If anyone else could join, that would be great. Okay, looks like that might be it. I think you can still join later on, so if you're just catching up, that's fine. Feel free to join in later, but I think we'll move on. Looks like we're pretty much stabilized at 17. So what we're going to do now is take you through a kind of an agroforestry journey, if you like. So that could be a hypothetical imaginary journey, or it could be a real one based on your experience. And we'll go through 4 different stages of the agroforestry journeys. The first one is thinking about how agroforestry fits into your whole farm approach. So taking a kind of very high level kind of first thoughts about how agroforestry could fit into your farm. And we're asking you to rank these 6 different kind of sources and tools and information sources and how useful you think they would be at this stage in your journey. So the next stage will be a bit more specific about the design of the agroforestry. So this is more kind of high level, holistic, whole farm planning. So on the Menti, you should just be able to select each of these and then move them around in order to rank them. So one person's figured it out already. Yeah, so there's quite a lot to look at here. So I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes to do this. So we have living lab or networking activity. So that was what Will was just talking about. There's visits to agroforestry farms, advisory visits. So that could be someone like a woodland trust advisor coming out. So it could also be a private consultant. We have the tree species guide. I appreciate you probably don't know much about that, but that's what I mentioned at the end of my talk. Then we have the agroforestry handbook that Will mentioned towards the start. That was published back in 2019. And then finally, we have digital tools like the PG tool, like Farm Tree or other digital tools. So I appreciate some of you might not be so familiar with some of these, but just have a bit of a guess, if necessary, as to what you think would be most useful at this stage of whole farm planning. So we've got 7 responses so far. I'll just give you another minute or 2 to think about that. So yeah, we've got 13 responses. I think most of you have done it. We'll just wait a bit longer for those who are still working it out. But yeah, some quite close scores there. Visits to agroforestry farms seems to be the most popular. Then we've got advisory visits in second, living labs in third, agroforestry handbook, and then tree species guide, with the digital tools being some way down at the bottom at this stage. It's great. So we've got 16. I think we had 17 last round. So just one person. So yeah, I'll just give you a few more seconds and then we can move on. Yeah, I think that that kind of makes sense. That fits in with, I think I would have chosen something very similar to that for the whole farm planning. So let's move on. Yeah, if you're still catching up, don't worry. I think you can still participate in the next stage. So at this stage, we have exactly the same 6 answers, but now we've finished thinking about our whole farm approach. We know kind of how we want agroforestry to fit into our farm enterprise, but now we want to get into the kind of nuts and bolts of designing the agroforestry system. So designing a bespoke agroforestry system for your farm. So this will include things like choosing what species or varieties of trees to plant, choosing the arrangement of trees, tree density. If it's an alley cropping system, then the width of your crop alleys and tree rows, as well as what fields you'll plant your trees into. The next question will be more specific about the establishment and management of trees. So this is just kind of the detailed design stage. So again, I'll just give you a couple of minutes to have a think about that and to rank your responses. Okay, we're doing well. So we've got about half people responded so far. I'll give you another minute or so to have a think about this. So at the moment, we've got the tree species guide on top, and then visits to agroforestry farms, and then advisory visits, followed by living labs, agroforestry handbook down in 5th, and then the digital tools down in 6th again. So yeah, that's good. So we're up to 12, 13, that's great. So I'll just move on in a few seconds. So yeah, I've got tree species guide and visits to agroforestry farms coming out on top on this category. So in the next stage, we're going to be thinking about the establishment and management of the agroforestry system. I'm just going to move on to keep things moving. Sorry if I've left you behind, but I think you can carry on participating in this next stage. So now we've thought about how agroforestry fits into our farm. We've designed our system, and now we want to think about the practicalities around establishing and managing trees in an agroforestry system. So this includes things like how practically are you going to plant the trees, things like tree protection, as well as the management of the trees, so things like pruning and coppicing. So again, we have exactly the same 6 options, and if you can rank them in order of how useful you think they will be at this stage. And then after this, we'll just have one final stage, and we can move on to a Q&A. So again, I'll just give you a couple of minutes. 4 people have gotten in there already. That's great. So I've already got 9 responses. So I'll just give you another minute or so to think about that. So here we've got visits to agroforestry farms coming out quite strongly in first place. An agroforestry handbook advisory visit in third, and then living labs and tree species guide tied in fourth. Great. So we're up to 13, which I think is similar to what we had in the last question. So I'll just give you a few more seconds. But yeah, we've got, again, visits to agroforestry farms is coming out top in most of these. Then we've got advisory visit second and agroforestry handbook in third. So I'll move on to the final stage of our agroforestry journey, which is thinking about how we're going to monitor the performance of the agroforestry system. So that includes the performance in terms of environmental sustainability as well as economics. So we've now planted our agroforestry system and we want to monitor how it's performing, how it's fitting into our farm. So again, we have exactly the same 6 options. And if you could just rank these again for this final stage. So we've got 10 responses already. I'll just give you another minute or so. It looks like most of you have responded to that now. So this time, yeah, not surprisingly, the digital tools are coming out on top, which I think I'd agree with that. And then we have living labs in second, advisory visits in third. Yes, that's 13 responses. I think that's the same as we had last time. So I'll just give you a few more seconds. And so in the final part, we'll move on to a Q&A shortly, but we'd be interested to hear whether you have any kind of general comments on the tools presented, particularly how useful you think they will be. That could be either from a farming perspective or a research perspective or policy. So the tools, including the public goods tool that I was talking about, and the tools that Will was talking about as well, including the farm tree. So if you do have any responses, any thoughts on them, would be really pleased to hear that. Perhaps we can kind of move on to a Q&A as well, while people are kind of thinking about that. Charlotte?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So I'll just, while that's ticking away in the background, yeah, we had quite a few questions coming in. So one of the first ones was a question about how you decided which farms and locations were included in the project. So there's a question about why were there no Scottish farms in the project. I know Agroforestry is in Scotland, but that wasn't part of REFOREST, was it? Or was it just one of your living labs?
Yeah, so if I'll just talk about PG tool and then I'll hand over to Will to talk about the living lab. But in terms of the farms that we use the public goods tool for, yeah, it was simply their proximity to Reading and the practicalities of us getting there, really, because we were, yeah, basically doing it ourselves. So we would like to include Scotland, and as I said, we are interested in including more farms. Perhaps if we have a few up in Scotland, then it could kind of justify a trip up there. So yeah, do get in touch if you're interested, and we would like to include some Scotland farms in that. So yeah, nothing against Scotland other than it being a long way. So yeah. Will, anything to add on the
well, I
living
think for
labs?
us it's a sort of partly strategic, partly pragmatic to focus on the North of England. Pragmatic in that a lot of the ORC team are based around Newcastle, Sunderland, Barnard Castle, that sort of area. And we also found that at the beginning of Reforest, there was fewer agroforestry engagement activities in the North compared with the South. I'm not sure if that's still people would say is the case or not. But anyway, North of England kind of worked for us in terms of a relatively, it was a big area, but nevertheless geographically defined and works for us, and an area where we felt we could make some impact.
Great, thank you. And do you also feel like, I know you just mentioned it, but do you feel like there's good data for agroforestry impacts and sort of establishment in sort of the upland environment in the Highlands?
I don't know what you feel, Tom. My sense is there's less, but I think there's been a lot done. For example, on the there's I showed you that review paper that was focusing on silver arable, so typically lowland systems. I'm not aware of a comparable review for upland agroforestry. I suspect that there is less evidence, that I haven't done an exhaustive search, but I think with uplands, it's my colleague Lindsay Wistance, who I expect some of you on the call will know. She sort of leads on the sort of the tree livestock kind of benefits and interactions, and I think she's done a lot to show what the benefits of those trees are for animals, for their well-being, for their health, and so on. So, and that draws upon both upland and lowland situations.
Yeah, that's really good to know. And especially I think it's quite salient when there's a lot of conversations about reforesting in the uplands as well. So it'd be interesting to see the degree to which you can integrate livestock and agroforestry in those environments. You also had a question about the tree species guide you shared, Tom, which is really exciting. And I think there'll be like a lot of enthusiasm for that. And we had a question whether it will cover the nutritional information or benefits of different species. As we know, a lot of farmers will be interested in planting trees, at least partially, as a source of fodder for their livestock. And so this will probably have relevance to them.
Yes, it does to some extent. So the kind of PDF guide just summarizes livestock fodder value for livestock simply as high, moderate, low, I think. But there is also an Excel database that would accompany the guide. And that database will contain a bit more information about some of the micronutrients based on what we know, which actually isn't much. We know quite a lot about things like willow and a couple of other species, but there's a lot of data gaps there.
So if people download the tree species guide, they can also download the Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah, that's the hope anyway. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And so then the high, low, medium fodder quality is more to do with like protein, or?
Yes, it's a bit of a mix. Yeah. So yeah, things like protein, but it does take into account kind of micronutrient levels as well.
Great, thank you. And then we had another question in the Q&A chat, which is about the possibilities around biochar, and is there a way in which woody biomass from agroforestry can be converted to that as a means of carbon capture? And is that something that either the Living Labs or the PG tool took into account at all? Were any of your participants engaging in that?
Well, yeah, we'll go in a moment, but yeah, I haven't heard of that being done in agroforestry actually, but I don't see why it couldn't be. And I know some agroforestry farmers use kind of wood chip, not biochar, but wood chip from short rotation coppets for fertility and carbon storage, like Ian Tolhurst being a good example of that. I'm not sure if you've heard of biochar in agroforestry, Will.
Not specifically actually, but well, not within Reforest at least. I think we a year or so ago we worked with Shropshire Council on a small agroforestry pilot, and it's through that project I became aware that council was actually interested in the potential of biochar production from pyrolysis, and I think they had a funded development project for that, and indeed have established a plant near Welshpool for biochar production. So I think that was in relation to recycling of green waste, council green waste, but in a sense, biochar, whatever the source material, the biomass, then it's no reason why it couldn't be a good use for an agroforestry product. But I'm not aware that within an agroforestry setting per se.
Great, thank you. And we had another question come up, which was, do you think that the recommended tree species for agroforestry need to change in light of climate change impacts? And I guess the resilience to sort of extreme weather.
Yes, it's a difficult one actually, because what we found in developing the guide is that species with better climate resilience tend to not or less likely to be native, and they tend to have kind of lower wildlife value as well. So we definitely need to think about that moving forward. And in the tree species guide, we have tried to include some of the slightly more novel species which are climate resilient. So things like walnuts and red oak, and one or two others as well. So yeah, that's a really important consideration, like climate resilience.
Great, thank you. We had another question as well, which is maybe going back to the PG tool results. And I'm not sure if this was in there or not, but there's a question about the evidence for positive effects in terms of biodiversity for agroforestry according to the PG tool. And was that a strong correlation? And if not, why not?
Yeah, so we didn't really include biodiversity specifically in the tool because it's quite difficult to kind of get that information from a farmer. So we just had agricultural systems diversity, which isn't quite the same. So yeah, it's not something we've specifically looked at as part of the really good tool. But yeah, it's an interesting point.
And then we also had a question about wider ecosystem resilience. And is that something that you use these other sort of metrics as a proxy for, or is that something that you can sort of evaluate in its own right?
For me, I think ecosystem resilience, that's a really kind of challenging facet to measure and to study it. I've been part of another project called AgroMix that was mentioned at the beginning as well. That's actually coming to an end at the end of this month, but this is another European Horizon project, which has been focusing on resilience of agroforestry and other mixed farming kind of approaches. And one of the ways which we tackle that kind of the measurement of that in a biophysical sense was actually characterizing the biodiversity, going back to that. So with the kind of basic premise that a more biodiversity is representative of a healthier ecosystem that's going to have a certain degree of redundancy in its species composition and therefore likely to be more resilient to impacts of climate change. So that was kind of our main approach to trying to study that in the field. And we did that through various studying various taxonomic groups, including soil microbes and ground-dwelling spiders and plants, bats, birds, and natural predators as well. So all of that information is coming out in a series of papers actually as we speak. There's been a couple, well, one published in particular, there's another one in the pipeline, another couple that are being prepared. So yeah, that was our approach to that. But it is quite a challenging thing to measure, characterize.
Great, thank you. I also had a question, just I'm going to put one of my own in here. So I think you made really clear sort of the need for agroforestry and the sort of robust knowledge infrastructure. Have you gotten a sense from the living labs and from the farmers you've worked with, the PG tool, what are the main sort of barriers to implementation and what sort of recommendations do you think there are for how to address that?
Yeah, shall I go first, Tom? I'm sure you've got something to say on that from the PG tool side of things, but I think well, I think something that comes out quite a lot is, in a sense, the understanding what the bottom line is. So, the kind of the economic case, the business case for agroforestry. I think that's quite a big gap in the UK as elsewhere, is to really have a good idea in terms of a farmer decision. Is it something that's viable for that enterprise? And I think there's a lot to do there, and it feeds not just into the sorts of data that are available now through things like the the Organic Farm Management Handbook that we produce, or the the equivalent other John Nicks and so on, but also thinking of this question of climate change and going back to that, and the resilience arguments of agroforestry, that perhaps those more extreme weather years, you're going to get maybe in a sense that's when the benefits of the trees start to come into their own, and you're getting the certain level of yield which will be better than in a kind of monocropping situation, which might be the other way around in a normal year. So essentially you're sort of stabilizing production perhaps in a way that it's going to make economic sense as well as ecological sense. But Tom, I don't know, do you have got anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think that's a good one. I think I'd also say complexity of work, and yeah, by planting trees, there is more work involved. There's more labor requirements, more admin as well. So that is a barrier for sure. And also I think risk. So yeah, I think farming is often quite a risk averse practice, and so by changing things and planting trees which may or may not produce what you want them to produce, and having the market available for that, so that's another key challenge as well. But I think a lot of the policies and improvements and advice we're seeing now is definitely helping to overcome that. So there's real momentum now in the kind of agroforestry movement that we're seeing.
I think that stabilizing effect is really relevant, and so maybe as extreme weather unfortunately becomes more common, maybe we'll see more people getting interested in it. But I know especially with the sort of extremely wet weather we had earlier this year, a lot of farmers who had agroforestry sort of systems said that might have been like their only viable crop from over the winter, and especially in drought as well. I think you sort of see the same result. We had a question about establishment of trees, and do you have any thoughts on the role of like natural colonization and growth, or in contrast to actually like tree planting initiatives and programs?
Yeah, well, I'll go first. But yeah, I haven't really come across natural establishment that much in my work, but I really like it as a concept, and allowing what can naturally colonize and grow makes a lot of sense in terms of the biodiversity. So yeah, something I'm interested to know more about, and there's a lot more interest in that, but it's an interesting area. Do you have any thoughts on that, Will?
Well, I think sort of naturally sort of established trees are getting the very best start in their lives when you compare with planting. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, we've within ORC, and Lindsay, who I mentioned, she's very interested in the potential to use kind of nursery species around your target agroforestry tree in the establishment phase. So in a sense, avoiding the plastic tree guard or that kind of infrastructure, to actually just sort of in a sense create a thorny mix of shorter term shrub species that are protecting your tree. That's not in a sense natural colonization, but it's maybe mimicking a bit more a natural system perhaps. So I think there's certainly arguments for it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then we had another question which kind of feeds back into one of the things I was wondering as well. When we think of like sort of multifunctional landscapes and landscapes that aren't just generating one benefit or outcome. And as I sort of was maybe mentioning earlier, we see a lot of people even in this sort of space talking about the idea of trees or farming and not both. So how do the targets for expanding tree cover equate to sort of the number of trees to be planted in the area they're expected to occupy? Is that quite a difficult thing to parse out, especially when you're talking about agroforestry systems?
I think that is quite difficult. I mentioned in my sort of intro about these targets within the environment plan and the environmental improvement plan, and there was this target of 10% of arable farmland, I believe, to have trees planted to create a silver arable. And I think based on some research by Cranfield University, the Woodland Trust have actually produced a report a couple of years ago, in which they're advocating for even more ambitious targets actually to meet net zero, and that's based on modelling of what the contribution the trees will be making in terms of capturing carbon But yeah, in terms of the areas, you could use a percentage, 10% or 30% of silver pasture. But it's otherwise, yeah. I'm not sure. I certainly haven't done the maths. I'm not sure anybody else has actually, quite what densities and area configurations will be needed really in the future. Obviously, we're seeing the rollout of these SFI options for agroforestry. The very low density and low density ones have been kind of produced so far. We're waiting to hear more about the other tiers of support for actually maintaining agroforestry, but also, planting the trees in the first place. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what the interest and take up of those are and what that's going to mean in terms of these areas going forward over the next years.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see to what extent these sort of like low density systems, while although very resilient for the farm systems they're in, how far they go towards meeting those sort of targets, I suppose. I'm just going to ask another question as well, which was, you sort of mentioned the sort of negative impacts of tree planting, I suppose, in the wrong environment or the wrong species. And so while we understand the importance of afforestation and things, what were some of those negative environments? How do you come to that kind of impact? And do you think there's plenty of like good provision to avoid that happening and to ensure that we're doing the right trees in the right place when there's such a huge demand for tree planting with these targets?
Shall I go first, Tom? On that? That's quite a challenging question, but I think obviously trees shouldn't be. I think the first thing to say is that trees shouldn't be planted everywhere. So that's in a sense why these first agroforestry SFI options, they're specifically for less sensitive areas, because we shouldn't forget that Britain's got some amazing wildlife rich species-rich grasslands as well. They need protecting. They're some of the rarest habitats we've got. So trees aren't a sort of a blanket kind of goal for everywhere. We should have trees everywhere by any means, and I think that should certainly be borne in mind. I mean, I think in terms of other negative impacts, I suppose it's Tom, you're talking about it can be quite disastrous if you're not planting the right trees, and I suppose that's might have an environmental implication dimension, but I mean certainly from an economic and a farmer's business perspective, that's perhaps more what you were referring to there. But have you got anything else on that, Tom?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. Yeah, I definitely agree that agroforestry isn't appropriate everywhere necessarily. I think it comes down to having good advice, having good demonstration farms as well, so to learn from mistakes that have been made on other farms. So that knowledge sharing is really important. That's something that we'll be looking at in REFOREST. Yeah, but also I think understanding that agroforestry isn't necessarily a kind of silver bullet to address all problems, and it is just one strategy of many different ways of farming more sustainably, really. So yeah, it needs to be kind of thought about whether it's appropriate for a specific farm, and then it needs to be carefully considered how it will fit into that farm. And then good advice plays a really important part in that, both from kind of public and private sectors, as well as that farmer to farmer learning.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much to both of you. I'm just going to wrap up now. And we actually do have a feedback poll. I know you're probably fed up of the sort of interactions and things, but I'm going to launch that now. And I'd really appreciate it if you did feedback on that, as we do take that into account and we always appreciate it. So I just want to say thank you so much to Tom and to Will for all of your insights. It's been really interesting to get such a nuanced perspective on all of this, because it's such an important topic. And I'm so happy that you joined to kick off the first of our winter webinar series. So we really appreciate you taking the time to share your fascinating work, and also to all of the work participants who joined and asked questions. And I would also like to thank the Agri-Food Network for funding this webinar. There's a QR code you can see on these slides, so that will take you to our Eventbrite page, where you can see all of the almost 30 webinars we have scheduled between now and the end of March. I'm sure we'll be over 30 in the next few weeks, as we're still planning some. And our next webinar is also with me, and that's on November 4th, and it'll be a more practical look at herbal lays and the practicalities and benefits of increasing diversity in your pastures. So I just want to say thank you again so much to Will and Tom for amazing session. And maybe I'll put your emails here, not to drop you in it, but for anyone who has any questions, you can get in touch with.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Alice.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks all.